So, darling, I think we have some things to talk about. Kenny's voice still sounded rough and cracked from the pain of the injury of his eye, and he still seemed very tired overall, exhausted even. Clementine's gaze softened. She wished that he could just rest a bit while they could, instead of using this time to talk to her. But he also knew there was no arguing with him. She nodded and sat up upon the counter next to where Kenny was leaning. "What is it?" she asked, blinking at him. Where could he even start? Really, there was many unsaid things between the two of them. And while sometimes it was good to keep feelings and words to a minimum, there was also nice letting them out. The older man leaned back for even further, placing his palms on the counter and looking down at the rough surface. "Remember the last time we were at a pharmacy?" "Great of all things." He had to start off with that. Clementine sighed and nodded. "Yes, I remember. Lee got me an energy bar and we spent some time in his parents' office." Kenny nodded, closing his eyes as if to envision himself in that place. The Everett's drugstore days after he had met Lee and Clementine with Katja and Duck by his side again, looking for him for guidance. Everyone knew that he was alive back then. Well, not everyone. Clementine's parents hadn't been, and if she found out later, but the Motor Inn group was alive and together as a family. "That's right, he did. Got one for me and Duck, too," Kenny said. "He'd always look out for both you kids, didn't he?" Her heart sank. It was more even painful territory of their memories. Remembering Lee's guidance was painful enough, but adding her friend made it much worse. Duck wasn't the brightest child, but at least he and Clementine had each other, and the world around them was crumbling. Recalling the days that she had played with him just caused her chest to hurt. Turning away, she mumbled, "I don't really want to talk about this." Kenny just must have realized he had did something insensitive. His eyes widened and then shook his head. "Oh shit. Sorry, Clem. I know it's hard for you. Hell, it's even harder for me too." Clementine nodded. "It's never been easy," she agreed, her gaze lowering. "So what made you hack that ass's arm off?" Kenny asked. She appreciated the quick subject change, but shrugged in response. "I just did what Lee would do." She was confident enough to what the man would have done. He had been there. If Lee were here, he wouldn't hesitate to help someone, even if the person was horrible to him. At least that was what Clementine believed, and she hoped that her memory of Lee wasn't inaccurate, and that he really was kind and compassionate as she remembered. "He didn't kill the St. John's brothers," she added, closing her eyes as the memories whirled around her. That farm was strongly remembered in her mind, as most of her senses recalled what it was like. The small fresh grass, the warm nostalgia associating with the sitting table for dinner, the feel of a cow's coarse fur, the frightening back room in the barn. It was all strong in her mind. She almost feared that she opened her eyes to see of Kenny, Lily, and Lee arguing in the meat locker. A hand touched her shoulder, and she nearly jumped. Once her eyes snapped open, however, the illusions were gone. She was in the pharmacy again with Kenny. "You okay, Clem?" Shaking her head, the girl replied, "Yeah, sorry, I was just remembering." Though she tried her hardest not to remember, things always just made her more past mental barrier. She doubt those times would fade any time soon, too. "It's all right. I was just saying that Lee raised you in a good way. I may have not agree with everything you do, but, well, you're more than capable of deciding things for yourself." It seemed to finally calm down on Kenny that she wasn't just a little girl anymore, that this world had stolen her innocence, and she had to move on without it. "Thank you, Kenny," she replied with a small, gentle smile. The man nodded, giving her a warm grin back, and his expression fell. Before she could even ask what was wrong, his gaze drifted over to Sarita, a dull look settling in his eyes. "Sometimes I wonder what Kat would have said about me moving on like this," he whispered. Though Clementine knew that she was more incapable to make her own decisions as an 11-year-old, normally she wouldn't be able to. She obviously could not help it in this department. If Lee were here, perhaps he could offer her some insights for his friend. But Clementine was just another child when it came to adult affairs like this. She shook her head and turned away for a moment. "I don't know," she admitted it, a bit sharply to remind Kenny who he was talking to. Kenny blinked at the realization of who he was talking to, seemingly dawning on him. "Fuck, sorry, this ain't the time, and you ain't the person I should be talking about this with." He placed a hand on her shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze, to which he nodded an understanding. While the both of her insights were just still on, Sarita and Kenny added quietly, I wonder if you'll ever get a thank you at the end for saving his life. Clementine shrugged. Honestly, she hadn't been expecting one, nor did anything really matter in a situation like this. We're all survivors, she pointed out. So we have to look out for one another, don't we? That was all she was doing at the end. You sure as hell don't mind me bashing in Carver's face. Well, that case was a bit different. He had held him prisoner, invoked fear in all of the family members, oppressed everyone in his system, made Carlos physically harm Sarah, and on top of it all, he beat Kenny and made him lose an eye. Clementine never thought any human could stop a walker's in terms of the monstrous behavior, but William Carver proved her wrong at the end. That was different, she muttered, narrowing her eyes, and if anyone deserved it, he did. Kenny smirked back at her, showing approval of her words. I couldn't agree more, Clem. Thanks, she replied. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about? Besides the fact that we're in a drugstore again, it kinda seems quiet without Larry or Lily barking at everyone. Nah, Kenny chuckled, under his breath, gazing at the floor as he was surely overwhelmed by the memories. Clementine looked away, towards another set of counters across the store, remembering she had to see Sarah. I need to go check on my friend, she murmured. I think she's really broken up over everything about Carlos. Given that Kenny had fallen apart after his entire family died at once, the man surely wasn't surprised. He nodded somberly. Go do what you need to, Clem. We'll chat more later if you like. The girl gave him one last glance, before walking across the store to where Sarah was curled up and sobbing. She peered over at the edge of the counter, whispering her name. The other girl didn't seem to take notice, rocking back and forth as she hugged her knees, her glasses noticeably cracked on her face. After hopping over the counter, Clementine bent down to her friend Sarah's level. Sarah? Sarah, it's me, she said, waving a hand in front of her face. It's Clementine. We made it out of the Walker horde. Sarah's lifeless eyes drifted to her friend, a very recognizable defeat shifting through her own brow irises. Her mouth hung open as she pushed the quiet broken words off her tongue. Not everyone made it out. Clementine's heart fell at the sight of her. Sarah was so naive in a way. She reminded Clementine of how she herself used to be. It was human nature, was due to protect someone so childlike. She was supposed to do something so precious and innocent. This nightmare world had to be cherished and guarded. Carlos wanted to keep the horrors of the world from his daughter until his gruesome end. The truth was that no one stayed innocent now. No one could keep something so treasured for themselves for so long. Eventually, the whole world would know and snatch it away. Sarah, I'm really sorry. Clementine was horrible at this sort of thing, but she was trying her hardest. She sat down in front of Sarah on her knees, her eyes shimmering with sadness. This had been hard to hear from Lee after she'd seen her parents as walkers, and it would have been hard for Sarah to hear, but he needed to be said. She lowered her head to look at the other girl in the eyes. Sarah, you need to hear me, she hissed quietly, making sure that her friend was looking back at her. She could only see the emptiness in the eyes behind the cracked frames. At least she was keeping eye contact. Clementine nodded. It continued. You're strong, Sarah. You're going to see bad things, but you'll make it, and I'll be here to help you. Her hands reached for her friend's, prying Sarah's cold fingers out of the fists as she clenched in despair to loosen her own around them tightly. The girl hiccuped, seemingly to be coming back to life from her previous shell state, leaning forward to wrap her arms around Clementine, sobbing into her shoulder. It hurts so much. Daddy! She wailed, her hands tightening around her friend's. Clementine let her cry it out, knowing that this would be a good end for her at the end. Once the girl's cries had finally seemed to subside, she lifted one of Sarah's hands and interlocked it with her pinkies. You're strong, and we'll be over for friends forever, no matter what happens, she promised. She knew she couldn't promise something as surgery as sweet as I'll never leave you, because that was very sugary and she knew that anyone could die at any time. She also realized Sarah would never be the same now, that she had to expose the other girl to the horrors of the world and teach her to protect herself. She had to be Sarah's Lee. Eventually, she shifted over and she was sitting next to Sarah, her fingers entwined, leaning her head against the older girl's shoulder. She'd realized how tired she felt all of a sudden. For now, she supposed that she could close her eyes and rest, just like how she wished Kenny would do. Though it was important to be alert at all times, Clementine recognized that if they were safe enough for now, she trusted the group enough to alert her if anything was breaking in. With a sleepy sigh, her eyes finally shut, listening to Sarah's breathing in and out, indicating she fell asleep too. Clementine let herself be dragged by the sleep's darkness. What the fucking hell is going on here? Why the hell did you guys do to me? At the loud, rough voice, Clementine's eyes snapped open and she instantly sprung to her foot in one hand, reaching for the cleaver to look at her belt. Her gaze she blurred from her slumber, tracking down the room. Nothing changes in the room since she had fallen asleep. Sarah was still next to her, and her eyes widened in alert. Clementine saw Rebecca was now seated in a cushion of some sort towards the back of the store. Kenny and Mike were nearly blocking her from view. Their faces were controlled with anger, directed towards the table where Troy was. Troy! Clementine's eyes whipped over to the table. Nuffin, their guest, was now seated up, in flare's glare as he struggled to stand up. Luke, Nick, and Jane surrounded him. Sarita a ways off behind them. Tightening her grip on the cleaver, Clementine sprinted over to him, just like the events that she would have to use it. However, once Troy noticed her with it, his eyes widened in surprise, and he seemed to be shrink back due to the instinctive of her associated with it. She couldn't blame him there. The weapon had sliced his arm off. But she didn't allow him any sympathy, and her eyes narrowed. She snapped, "How long have you been awake?" The man's mouth hung open for a few minutes. His eyes started about before he stammered out, "You better answer question. How the hell did I get here? And how long was I out, you little shit stain?" Bonnie, who Clementine had nearly forgotten about in the large group, sounded from behind her. "Troy, you think you should be thinking about being nicer to Clementine. She saved your life, you know." Troy's features softened for a moment before he glared up and away. "The hell do you mean? Where did my arm go? Why does everything frickin' hurt? And why does everyone smell like shit? Why do I smell like shit?" He then looked around, finally noticed how many people were near him. Clementine narrowed her eyes and pursed her lips, giving him a sour look. He gave her one right back. "The hell are you looking at?" Suppressing the urge to roll her eyes, Clementine crossed her arms. "I cut your arm off. Did you forget?" Just for emphasis, she showed him the blade, still stained with his blood. He flinched as he saw it, his eyes darting between her and it. "Why did you—" His teeth clenched and a low grumble in his throat, if he had the trouble connecting to the pieces of the puzzle. "Because you were bitten." Her eyes narrowed further into slits. He scoffed, curling up his lip to smirk and wrenching himself off the table, wobbling a bit on his feet. It seemed like he wasn't getting used to being one-armed just yet, obviously, and had to take a few minutes before straightening his spine, if he could get the air of the authority he had back in Carver's camp. I don't think I'm frickin' grateful. It don't change nothing. Either back to frickin' work, y'all, or do I need to get Bill over here to help me smack y'all around?" He sneered, look turning to Clementine. When she didn't move, "Did I frickin' stutter?" It almost sounds as if he was desperate to be in charge again, asserting himself from somebody else above when he clearly wasn't any longer. Luke crossed his arms. "Troy, Bill's dead." As this silent, shocked look on the older man was giving him, he continued, "And we're not at Howe's anymore. We managed to escape by covering ourselves in walker guts. That's what we all smell like." Nick nodded. "You're a lucky son of a bitch, too. Clem hacked your arm off after you got bit." He reiterated to Clementine's earlier words, looking away uncomfortably. Troy looked flabbergasted. His mouth hung open, his eyes looking about, his breath catching in his throat as he tried to speak. I don't get..." He shook his head, looking at Bonnie. "Why you ain't ordering them around?" Bonnie sighed. Because I helped them escape, Troy. I couldn't take what Bill was doing to them any longer. And now you owe these people your life. So I recommend start fresh in here. At least you can do, considering. The man then scoffed, nearly falling over in the process of walking up to her. I don't gotta do shit, Bonnie. You actually do, Jane replied, taking a step forward and wickedly smug smile. You don't get to make the rules anymore, Troy. She seemed overjoyed at the fact, and looked as her eyes seemed dangerous. She's right, Luke added. Now you could simply comply and be our ally, but if not, we'll consider you a prisoner. It's as simple as that, Troy. While it seemed clear that Luke didn't enjoy Troy's company here, at least willing to work beside him if he cleaned up some of his act. Clementine felt the same, really. She didn't like Troy and didn't think that she would anytime soon, but she had to make sure that he didn't put any of her friends in danger. Of course, she was still getting used to his one arm, so it would take a bit for him to get to his bearings. He wouldn't have had a big fire rifle if he had showed off back at Carver's. He would have had to rely on blades or smaller guns now. He then shot down from Troy's way. It's your choice in the end. The man considered his options, his face lightening with tension for a few moments. He looked around at the others and with those that pushed him around and yelled during his religion under William Carver. But those days were over. He was stuck with them for now, and Clementine had to imagine that it felt scary. Being in a new place with people who he hated you. But he brought it upon himself, so she didn't feel much sympathy for him. At the end, his facial expression clarified that he was very unhappy, but still nodded, Fine, I'll stick with you assholes until I can go on my own way. She even wondered that would be exactly, hopefully soon.